Welcome, everyone. My name is Asher Miller, and I'm the Executive Director at Post Carbon Institute. It's my honor to host today's event. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Vanessa Andriotti and Dugald Hines for joining us today for Acceptance and Agency at the End of Modernity, a special Resilience Plus event. Now, I know it's April Fool's Day, and there are probably many people who would find the topic of today's conversation foolish, or at least confusing, considering that for much of the world, modernity is something they take for granted as a permanent reality, kind of like gravity. But I can assure you that this conversation is being held with serious attention. That said, it doesn't mean we can't enjoy our time together. Before I introduce my guests, though, I want to take a minute to acknowledge all of those who can't be with us today, the many humans in the more than human world, both alive today and generations to come, for whom the implications of modernity and its end are as real as for each of us. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests. Dugald Hine is a social thinker, a writer, and a speaker. After an early career as a BBC journalist, he went on to co-found the Dark Mountain Project, where he was the director until 2019. He co-authored with Paul Kingsnorth Uncivilization, the Dark Mountain Manifesto, and in 2023 he authored At Work in the Ruins, Finding Our Place in a Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics, and All the Other Emergencies. Dugald's latest writing can be found on his Substack, Writing Home. He's also co-creating a school called Home, a quote-unquote gathering place and a learning community for those who are drawn to the work of regrowing a living culture. Welcome, Dugald. And Vanessa Andriotti. Vanessa has worked internationally in education related to global justice, Indigenous knowledge, and environmental crises. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria and author of Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. Vanessa is a co-founder of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Arts and Research Collective and a co-designer of the course Facing Human Wrongs, Climate Complexity, and Relational Accountability. Welcome, Vanessa. So Vanessa, I recently heard you share a very different kind of land acknowledgement, which is often done at these kinds of events. A different kind of land acknowledgement than we typically hear at the start of events. So would you be willing to share that with us now to help us land differently?
Thank you, Asher. I have it here in my screen, so I will invite people to follow that with me. But before going there, I'm acknowledging I'm also speaking from the unceded lands, the Songhees and the Esquimalt peoples here in what is known today as Victoria. But this different land acknowledgement, I think, is a little bit broader. So it's called Landing with the Land Differently, an invitation. There's a preamble. And in the preamble, we start with, there's a game at play. A game that looks like care, sounds like reckoning, and moves like change. But it's none of that, really. Modernity plays this game masterfully. It turns grief into branding, justice into metrics, land acknowledgements into rituals of plausible deniability. Modernity whispers, say the words, get the points, move on. Perform care loudly enough, and no one will ask what you've actually shifted. But here today, we are invited to try something different. Before this moment becomes another transaction, we name the shenanigans. Not to shame, not to posture, not to police, but to interrupt the spell. To loosen the grip of modernity's smooth maneuvers. To create a space where we might actually land. Not on the surface, not in performance, not in strategy, not in design thinking, not in deliverables, but in the awkward, sacred mass of being in relation. The naming, the greeting, the invitation. Look at your hands, not just as hands, but as land in motion. The minerals in your bones, the iron in your blood, the water moving through you. None of it yours, all of it borrowed, all of it belonging elsewhere, before you. Look at your feet. Feel their weight on the ground. this ground that has carried more than you will ever know. Feet that walked before colonialism set in, feet that arrived in shackles, feet that ran when there was nowhere safe to run, feet that stood their ground, feet that never made it home. This land remembers, even when we forget, even when we renege, even when we pave over the knowing. And yet, the land still moves inside us. It shifts, breathes, pulses, holding all that has been, all that will be. Before we begin, before we fall into the rhythm of polished acknowledgement, before we let modernity metabolize this moment into currency, let's name the ways we slip away from the work. Through urgency, through exhaustion, through over-intellectualizing, through tearing each other down, through seeking a purity that does not exist, through seeking a purity that does not exist. Let's name the way certainty can become another kind of erasure, the way self-importance can become another kind of forgetting, the way even the best intentions get caught in the gravitational pull of look at me being a good person. And still, let's name the invitation to be here, not to posture, to prove, to convince, or to impose. To be here, not to step into guilt, moral performance, or strategic positioning, but to be here to compost, to break down what's stagnant, to move what is stuck, to get our hands in the dirt, not as saviors, not as martyrs, not as heroes, but as part of a metabolism much older than we are. Because the land is not just under us, it's in us, in the power we fear and desire, in the systems we resist and depend on. And the land does not need our permission to speak. It speaks in soil and stone. It speaks in wind and water. It speaks in static and signal, in the interface that jolts us awake. So today we're trying to listen, to feel, to witness and move the pain that got stuck unprocessed, without drowning in sadness, without burning in anger, without escaping into moralism, without turning away. To stay with more moving layers of complexity, to let the body guide what the mind resists, to trust that even in the discomfort, even in the unraveling, something is waiting to decompose, and something is waiting to sprout and bloom. And so, not because we're ready, not because we have the answers, not because we have purified ourselves of the shenanigans, but because the body is already yearning to move differently, to land differently. You can join this collective inquiry dance, or just observe, sit with it, or laugh, because laughing is metabolizing too. Either way, we're here, and the land is a yapper. It is singing, laughing, crying, shitting, farting, screaming, and if you have not noticed yet, kicking our ass. So now pause, not to consume these words, not to agree or disagree, but to sit with what this invitation might cost you, not in theory, but in embodiment and in relationship. What if interrupting the shenanigans means letting go of the identity and status that has kept you feeling useful, needed, and central? What if it means realizing that your perceived entitlements to clarity, certainty, and moral high ground were never innocent? What if the version of you that always needs to know, fix, guide, or protect is quietly reenacting the very harm you think you've outgrown? What if being a good person has become the very shield that keeps you from being in relation? What if this invitation isn't asking for more performance, but less performance, less saviorhood, less mastery, less being the central authority, and instead, more pause, more listening without agenda, more trembling in the face of not knowing, more courage to be discentered, not as punishment, but as a gesture of trust, in the wider web you claim to care about. This isn't about guilt, not about shame, not about blame. It's not about being right. It's about staying with the trouble, the nausea, the friction, the dissonance, long enough to let it change you, long enough to feel what your certainty is protecting you from, long enough to hear what you've been drowning out, long enough for the pedestal beneath your feet to crumble into soil, and for you to finally feel the ground. So in response, how will we use this sacred time together?
Thank you, Vanessa. Got some chills there. Now, we've heard from some folks that your audio is quite low. I don't know if there's a way that you can adjust that or just speak up, Vanessa. But would it be okay if we shared those words? We'll send it in an email afterwards so folks can sit with it even more, especially those who weren't able to catch every word. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, here we are talking about some heavy things that none of us are expert in. And obviously, one part of the topic is this question of modernity. And I wanted to start with you, Dougal, because I think people have different definitions of this word. It means different things. It conjures up different images in their mind. So I'm curious, just for you personally, how would you define modernity? What comes to your mind or to your heart when you think of it?
Thanks, Asha. Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of stories that get told about modernity, a lot of jostling, competing languages and academic discourses and language games around it, to the point where it can be an off-putting word. It's not always a helpful word to throw into the middle of a conversation. It's not language that I use in all of the spaces that I move through. But there is a story that I've found helpful that's one of the stories that can be told about it. And it goes like this. People always have had a sense of a before and an after. Now, we haven't always privileged that, made it the exclusive sole way of inhabiting time and being in a world together, but it's always been part of the repertoire of these kinds of creatures we are. But it was only in certain places at a certain moment that it began to seem obvious to certain people that the fact that they lived after their ancestors was the most important, the most defining, the best thing, the thing worth naming themselves after. The idea of identifying as being modern is born out of a certain strange relationship to time, where we've remade time into this singular, converging, rising arrow where all of history was pointing towards us now, those of us who live closest to the future. And there were people in cities like Paris and London, certain people who wrote books, people who had certain kinds of conversations, who started to tell this story about themselves and their time. And it was a story that spread outwards and wove its way into the lives and realities of more and more people, until eventually we ended up in a world that had been profoundly shaped by and profoundly entangled with this story, which says those who live closest to the future, as if there is a single future, as if there is a single converging trajectory, are the leaders, the ones who are setting the course for everybody else. And people began to live inside this story in different ways. And you can see this story starting to end. You can see it stuttering really from early in the 20th century in the very parts of the world where it began. The First World War did a huge damage to it because the sense of an onward machine was not damaged by the war, But the moralistic stories about the virtues of it were utterly wrecked. And so you can see this when you read people who were writing 100 years ago. They were beginning to try and inhabit some of the same space that Vanessa and I are trying to inhabit with the work that we're doing in order to make sense of the wreckage of the stories they had grown up hearing. And this ebbs and flows through the 20th century until by the 1970s, particularly because of the news that's coming in from the front lines of environmental science. There is this sense that increasingly the future no longer feels like a location of promise, a thing you can tell stories about and mobilize people around. And instead, the future becomes a source of anxiety, a thing that we want to be distracted from. And so a lot of our cultural energy goes into building this giant distraction machine, which much of the internet is a part of, all because we're already living deep into the failure of that story and its promises and that sense of promise that for a while, for a good number of people, it certainly truly held. And as that fails, the things that were left out of that story, the things that were not marked on its maps, become harder to ignore. And that's what brings us into the kind of conversations that brought me and Vanessa together and that bring us all together today.
Thank you, Dougal. Um, one thought I had when you were talking about sort of the history of modernity as a story, it made me think of the end of history. There was this moment there, right, with the fall of the Soviet Union, that some people thought this is it. We've reached this point, and when you look around, maybe speculation of the end of war and neoliberal economics would open up things and technology would connect us all, and quite a utopian vision. And now we see, I think, people reeling very much from the fact that that story didn't hold up, even just in a matter of a couple of decades. So the destabilization of that, I think, is pretty profound. But I want to ask, Vanessa, you've talked about the house of modernity and the four denials that maintain it. So maybe you could just give a quick overview of that to help ground us into this conversation. Oh, can't hear you. You're muted.
For getting us started, and this is always a pleasure to be in the space with you.
I'm going to ask you again to speak up a little bit. Sorry to make you yell.
No worries. So I belong to a collective of social cartographers called Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures. And this collective works on the principle that reality cannot be reducible to language, and therefore the maps we have to navigate reality are social conventions that are actually quite arbitrary. They are arbitrary in relationship to the whole of reality, but they are very, very real to the social networks that have created this convention. So we try to map the social conventions that structure the moment we're in based on critiques, and both coming from decolonial, post-colonial, Marxist, neo-Marxist critiques, but also merging them with indigenous critiques that are not often emphasized in academic discussion. So then we came up with this metaphor of a house sitting on a planet, and this house is exceeding the limits of the planet, and we called it the house that modernity built. And we try to bring all these critiques together so that we don't isolate them. And the first thing about this house is the foundation of the house, which then comes from indigenous critiques that say that the root of our problem is separability, the imposed sense of separation between us and the rest of nature. And this separability creates hierarchies of value between species, between cultures, between individuals, and it also renders the land as property. So that is the foundation of the house. And then there are two carrying walls. The first carrying wall is the carrying wall of the modern nation state, which we tend to think about being there to protect people.
But if we study the history of the modern nation state, it's there to protect property. It was created to protect property in the interest of property owners, and the protection of people through civil rights, labor rights, human rights, indigenous rights has only happened when there's interest convergence between protecting the interests of capital and protecting the interest of people. When there's no interest convergence, the state defaults back to protecting capital. The other carrying wall is the carrying wall of Enlightenment humanism, a single story of progress, development, and civilization that erases the legitimacy of other stories or other even possible stories, creating the conditions for what some authors would call epistemicide, the killing of the legitimacy of other possibilities. And last but not least, there is the roof of this house, which we can talk about today in terms of algorithmic shareholder speculative capitalism, where there is a fiduciary duty of every businesses to create value and profit for shareholders who are then also anonymous. So we talk about this house as having a compromised roof, and the rest of the structure also crumbling, also because it extracts from the planet what it sees as resources and dumps back the sewage and the waste, and it has reached or breached the limits of the planet. It has there's an overshoot problem here, and there's also the hidden violence of this house. So for those who live in the house, it looks like the shiny promises of progress, prosperity, and security are a result of ingenuity, human ingenuity, rather than exploitation, expropriation, genocides, and ecocides. So I'll pause there because it has been a useful bringing together for us that lays the problem as a cartography very much on the table in the shortest possible period of time. Like, we don't have much, our attention spans are not very good, because we're also affected by algorithmic modernity and by the attention economy and having our attention mind. So this has been a very useful social construct for us to start conversations about the problem of the house falling apart.
Thank you. I do think the metaphors are really helpful, and that's a particularly helpful one. And I know you have a visual that you've also created that helps people sort of imagine it as in some ways as a system, a reinforcing system, though it is hitting its limits, right? It's interesting. This is a question I had that I wanted to ask you to go, but we also got someone who asked a question about this as well, who submitted in advance, which gets to the role that the fear of death plays. You can talk about things that people don't like to talk about very much, at least in the culture that I'm steeped in. There's a denial there that I think exists very much in the society. And I'm just curious if, when you think about modernity and sort of the myth of progress, and you look at things that are driving the forces driving modernity in terms of ideas of like the singularity, or we're going to colonize the stars, and how much of that do you think, what is the role of the fear of death, do you think, that keeps many of us keeps us locked into the story and keeps us from hospicing modernity?
Right. Well, I mean, just thinking about what Vanessa was leading us through there with the house, and this indigenous critique of modernity that says, the foundation of modernity, the deep root of this lies in separation, in separability, in the illusion of separability, and then the construction of institutions and ways of being in the world and ways of being human together that take that as an assumption they don't even know they're making. I think that even without anything else in play, that would generate a particular problem around death. Because once you have this idea of this radical separation between humans and everything else, between you and every other human, then your death looms in a different way. There is a line that's attributed to Ayn Rand: "When I die, the world dies." And in a way, it's one of these pure expressions of these kind of logics of modernity that we can describe with these different stories and try and turn around and look at from different angles, is that modernity ends up asking each of us to shoulder the impossible weight of being the whole world, because we've cut ourselves off from the whole world. And so in order to have a sense of agency, we have to somehow become some nightmarish way of imagining what it might be like to be God. And so then when I die, everything is over. Death has become no longer a companion in the journey of life. John Berger talks about that in a beautiful book called "And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos." He says, until relatively recently, everyone's life was lived with death as a companion. And there are multiple ways in which that has been expunged from the social and cultural landscape of modernity. And of course, part of what makes it hard to look closely at this, to name it closely, is that some of the things that have happened that mean that death is less proximate to, many of us on a call like this, are achievements that it's hard to be against. When you look at what has been achieved in recent generations in the transformations of maternal and infant mortality, it's an extraordinary thing. And sometimes that can almost silence the kind of questioning that we're trying to engage in this work. And it took me a number of years of sitting with this, and it actually took me to the point where I'd become a father myself and was experiencing viscerally the remarkable thing of being able to look at this young creature and come from a time and a place where it seemed normal to almost take for granted that I would live to see him grow strong and he would live to see me grow old. And that gets bundled up into parts of how the story of progress is sold and marketed to us to shut us up, to stop us trying to ask the sorts of difficult questions that are in play here tonight. But what I gradually realized, especially once I started to get into conversation with midwives and people who had worked with birth and people who'd worked with death, was the way to honor the things that have changed in recent generations that result in those impressive statistics about infant and maternal mortality is not to bundle them up with everything else into this package of progress where everything is dependent on everything else, but to lean in and listen closer and attend to the specifics, the practices, the knowledges that might be things we can rescue from the car crash that modernity is in and headed further into, and hopefully take with us, but in a humbler mode than the way in which modernity has wanted to talk about its achievements. And so for a while, it was possible for some of us to live as if death was under control and would soon be conquered. But it didn't lead to living well. It led to the kind of madness that produces "when I die, the world dies." And in one way or another, most of the human cultures around us and before us and our ancestors have known something about this. And they've known that actually the companionship of death is something that is required for you to become a grown-up, for you to become someone who's capable of showing up with sobriety and maturity and paying back all that's been given to you in order for you to make your way to adulthood. And so what you find across many, many cultures is that there are initiations and practices on the threshold into becoming a young grown-up that involve a very real and not risk-free staged encounter with the reality of your own death, so that you don't meet it for the first time further down the path of a life when it comes to you for real. And we've lost that, and we're suffering from that. And it gets in the way of our ability to look clearly at what it means to be living in a time of endings, and not to mistake that for everything being over and us having this black certainty, which is often what replaces the confidence that was there previously in progress and the promises of modernity.
Whew. There's a lot there, Dugald. I mean, one quick response is the sterilization, in a sense, right, of death in modern society, in our unwillingness to face it, or just the conditions that many of us are wrapped in, not allowing us to contend with it earlier in life, as you mentioned. It feels like the response to that, as we're dealing with endings, the prospect of endings, and climate, I think, represents that to many people. Not only do some people resort to fatalism, which is kind of the flip side, right? And then that is why we kind of termed this conversation about acceptance and agency. But then you also have a doubling down, tripling down of technology or attempts to keep death at bay forever, right? That's what the singularity, I think, represents. If we can merge with technology, if we can go colonize space, those kinds of things. So it just feels like in this society, there is so little of sitting with that reality. I don't know if there's anything, Vanessa, you'd want to add before I turn to more practical matters.
I think one story that can be told is that the House of Modernity was created to protect us from the rest of nature and to control the indeterminacy of the forces of life, right, and death. So in that sense, the sense of giving us a sense of control, predictability, certainty, so that this pedestal that was given to modernity could guarantee that at some point we would be able to defeat death because we are the gods, at least in the house. And I have been talking to a project that is intergenerational called Rewiring for Reality. And in that project, the invitation from Afro-descendant indigenous elders is to see the purpose of life not as having a good life as modernity dictates, but having a well-died death. And having a well-died death at the moment of that requires that at the moment of death, you can look back and say it was a well-lived life, right? So it's two things that are it's two faces of the same coin. And that would take us away from receiving an imposed coding, algorithmically engineered, about what a good life means in terms of modernity's promises and modernity's economies. So I would like to leave that question here as well. And the question is, what if the purpose of life, instead of having a good life, is having a well-died death?
It's strange to call that lovely, but I do think that that's a lovely sentiment. Let's get to some of the uglier sides of things. Many of us are in the United States. Even folks who are not in the U.S. are being deeply impacted by what's happening here politically. But there are things happening politically all across the world, particularly in societies that are deeply steeped in the story of modernity. And there's this strange dynamic, at least this is the way I would characterize it, is that here, at least in the US, it seems that the left is trying to uphold the institutions of modernity and the status quo in the face of what is seen and understood rightly as attacks on these institutions of governance and government and tradition, the Constitution, law, human decency, all these things. So the response to that is to try to uphold the institutions and the status quo that perpetuates modernity, which I think everyone here on this call probably would agree is unsustainable, right? And then you have the right, which is embracing policies that both destroy and accelerate the end of modernity, not to mention all kinds of really dangerous strands that are emerging, around natalism and blood and soil stuff. And so I'm just curious how the hospicing of modernity is not something that's happening in political cycles, right? It's a bigger story, but we are living in a particular current political reality. So how do you view these things in a relationship with one another, Vanessa?
So it's interesting because before January, many people would ask me, what's the evidence that modernity is dying? Or even sometimes, what's the evidence that it is violent? And then you have to do all the labor in trying to explain, which has a cost. But I have not been asked this question since January, right? Where you see that while for the left, modernity is in life support and should remain so, for the right, they're pulling the plug. And pulling the plug specifically on the liberal sides of modernity. And you can think about it as a wave of an empire cresting, crashing, and then we are in the undertow of this empire creating another wave because it has already crashed and its position in the world has already changed. And I think that, and I heard this at Pioneers in conversation with Olivia, talking about the meta crisis, that what seems to be happening is that the right is actually bringing the future into the present. What we see in terms of politics, like emerging politics, is that Trump and the whole administration is already planning for a post-climate collapse world and thinking about preemptively about security in a very different future, something that the left has refused to do because it has focused on the continuity of expanding that house without paying attention to the overshoot. And that is, I think, unprecedented in terms of having different empires already planning for a different kind, a post-climate collapse future. So it's the reality has already shifted because the kinds of politics we're living has shifted, and it's gradually going to impact us. And you may describe it as a descent into madness, right? I've heard this also. I think it was Douglas Rushkoff who said a descent into madness. But when you frame it like that, you forget that there was a cost for keeping the house in stability. And this cost was placed on the majority of the world and on the land and on our relationships. So it's very interesting now to see the destabilization period, which some may call collapse, or in how to turn this collapse into a reckoning so that it can become a threshold for a different kind of existence through the pain of it. And nobody is wishing for pain. We are observing the pain. And there's something that I find very interesting in the North American context. It's back to the concept of this talk, which is this inflated sense of agency that we should, it should be as I think it should be, rather than a space of presencing and attuning and co-stewarding things, which I see more in the global South and the cultures where I come from, because we were done to, like the US empire was something that was done to us. We had not the same kind of agency. There is agency that is unimaginable from the North American perspective, but that is not on a pedestal that tries to impose our will on the world. So that imposition of the will on the world in this context of destabilization, that inflated sense of self-importance creates the conditions for a fall from a much higher space than in comparison if you're closer to the ground, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure if this is becoming too metaphorical, but I'll pass it to Dougal. Dougal, help me here.
Well, I'm finding it helpful to hear your read on the journey of these past 2 or 3 months. You know, we're a quarter of the way into 2025 now. It's a good moment to just do an initial taking stock of what's changed. And I'm noticing similar things. One of the ways it shows up for me is that I'm getting approaches most weeks now from people inside large organizations who want me to talk to their colleagues about the things I was writing about in At Work in the Ruins. And those people were probably reading the book a year or 2 or 3 years ago, but they couldn't have imagined trying to officially bring me in to talk about these things. And now, you know, the reality, the center of gravity of the reality that they and the people around them are inhabiting has shifted dramatically. I've been thinking about something that a conservative American journalist, Alana Newhouse, wrote 4 or 5 years ago, which, you know, echoes something that I've also heard from you, Vanessa. The way that she puts it is, she says, I think the divide within our societies today is between those who think that our existing systems and institutions can be fixed and made fit for purpose, and those who see them as broken beyond mending. And she was saying this 4 or 5 years ago and saying this really doesn't map to any of our existing political lines. And when I heard it, one of the things it resonated with was the map that you and the collective have where you talk about the beyond reform position. And what she was saying is it's getting to the point where it's 50-50 within the rich world societies between those who've arrived at the beyond reform position, the position she calls brokenism, and those who are still believing that somehow it can be fixed. And I think we're now past that line. What's been going on, as far as I can see until very recently, is a failure of the left and liberals and actually of the mainstream environmental movement to be willing to reckon with the process that was already underway, the process that makes everything feel broken. And that has been exploited cynically by forces that, you know, are on an axis of, you know, from the far right through into the strange space libertarianism of Silicon Valley, who have no intention of delivering very much for the people whose votes they've been able to harvest. But they have been able to speak at a visceral level to that sense of brokenness, whilst all of the, you know, sane seeming, respectable seeming voices of the mainstream from the center right leftwards, right the way out to the left-hand side of the spectrum, have been wedded to versions of sustaining modernity at all costs. And so then where I see us at, well, I remember, Vanessa, when we were in Paris in 2018, that weekend when the Gilets jaunes, yellow vests protests were going on, and you'd just come from Brazil and Bolsonaro had just been elected. And you said to me, it makes a lot of difference whether people feel that the promises of modernity could have been kept if it hadn't been for those bastards who were corrupt, or if they recognize that those promises could never have been kept, that they were unkeepable, that it wouldn't even have been a good thing to keep trying to keep those promises. And so now, you know, when I look at this title we've got tonight of acceptance and agency, it takes me back to the conversations we've had and the work we've done around the 12-step movement and recovery, and how the paradox that 12-step is a really, really important carrier of costly knowledge about right in the heart of modern Western societies, is that there is a kind of agency that can only come on the far side of surrender. Because the first step of the 12 steps is we admitted that we were powerless, gave up our pretensions to be able to take control of the situation. And having taken that step, you know, they say there are plenty of alcoholics who've got sober on the first step alone. There is a transformation that can begin only with that admission of powerlessness. And part of, you know, in the depths of all of the horror and all of the front lines where real resistance is needed against what is being done by the American regime and elsewhere right now, there is also, you know, a very tenuous constituency for what these political forces are doing. It's not, you know, so long as they don't manage to dismantle democracy altogether, it's not at all clear that they can hold together a constituency behind it, especially if we can begin to find ways of getting together below the scale of politics as performance in the places where we actually live, where there are plenty of things that need conserving and plenty of things that need liberating in ways that don't fit inside the boxes of the liberalism and conservatism of modernity. And, you know, I'm not pretending to be deeply hopeful about this, but I feel something similar to you about something that was stuck in a way that wasn't healthy has been released, even as some deeply, deeply evil things are being done more openly than they would have been done before as part of the same process.
Thank you both. Just a quick response, which is that not to make this false polarity between right and left, but I think there is this very difficult reality. I'll speak for myself, right? The difficult reality of recognizing that modernity has come with incredible consequences and is unsustainable and is coming to an end whether we like it or not, right? And at the same time, the manifestation of this right now is cruel and in the hands of people who are not trying to help hospice it in a way. And in fact, many of the people behind it or who have a tenuous adherence to it, it's about making something great again, right? And so there's still this question of resistance, which I think many of us are compelled to do because it is unequal, certainly. And this has been true for climate. It's been true for many of the consequences of modernity being felt most on those least responsible, including the more than human world. And it's like, you know, accepting on some level, releasing our sense of control is really critical. And at the same time, what do we do with the nature of this thing, you know? And that is a tension. I want to bring up a quote that you from Amitav Ghosh that you had in your book, Dougal, and because I think it's an interest. It gets to this question of how we interact with the end of modernity. So I'm gonna read it now. Over the last few decades, the arc of the Great Acceleration has been completely in line with the trajectory of modernity. It has led to the destruction of communities, to ever greater individualization and enemy, to the industrialization of agriculture, and to the centralization of distribution systems. At the same time, it has also reinforced the mind-body dualism to the point of producing the illusion, so powerfully propagated in cyberspace, that human beings have freed themselves from their material circumstances to the point where they have become floating personalities decoupled from a body. The cumulative effect is the extinction of exactly those forms of traditional knowledge, material skills, art, and ties of community that might provide succor to those vast numbers of people around the world, and especially to those who are still bound to the land as the impacts intensify. And this is the key piece. The very speed with which the crisis is now unfolding may be the one factor that will preserve some of these resources. And so it raises to me this question of, um, you know, the speed of it collapsing, the speed of the crisis. Should we be engaged in hastening modernity's collapse? And what would that look like? I'm going to open it up to both of you, either of you who have a response to that question.
Well, I guess my first response to it would be to call us back to that distinction between different ideas of agency that Vanessa was speaking about before. Because the idea that you and I and anyone on this call, or even all of us together on this call, can significantly accelerate or slow down the unraveling that is underway probably belongs to that inflated kind of agency that we need to surrender, that we need to give up in order to even notice that there are other kinds of agency on the far side of such a surrender. And then, the question is, yes, but what do we do? And the answer is, well, it's not a collective we that does. It's the doing is contextual. It starts from noticing. It starts from what happens when we retune our awareness. And this is what, the GTDF practices and the Hospicing Modernity book and so on are so helpful for, is they give us things that we can get together in human scale groups and do that help to retune the attention whilst staying in the uncomfortable places we find ourselves rather than trying to run for the hills of an imagined purity. And so then, what it looks like may be for some of us in the contexts we're in being part of the dismantling of existing institutions or the creating of ways to channel resources that belong within the games of those institutions outside of those games to contribute to the conditions of possibility for worlds worth living in when those games are over. And for others of us, it may look like defending the parts of the achievements of modernity that are worth defending and trying to find ways to take with us. And for others of us, it may be putting our bodies on the line or sheltering people we know who the authorities are going to try and disappear. And there are going to be, we could spend all evening making a list of all of the other things that would be worth doing. And that's the scale. Ivan Illich, who, although I never met him, is kind of the great teacher behind a lot of my work because I got to know and work with a lot of his friends and collaborators. And one of them told me that towards the end of his life, he used to say, the limit of political possibility today is the number of people who can sit around a table and share a meal together. And at first, that sounds really pessimistic. But there can be lots of different tables around which people are sitting and sharing meals together. Everyone doesn't have to sit at the same table every night. My friend Andrew, who writes Bog Down and Aster on Substack, talks about the flotilla of tables that come closer together and move apart and are all, in this friendly alliance without anyone actually knowing the scale of it, without us needing maps from above of it, without it looking big enough to even register as a threat to those who think that they own the future. And that's, all of these kinds of doing, most of them can be nurtured, at least to begin with, on that scale of the company of the table and the fellowship of those tables that are neighbors to each other.
Thank you. I love that that vision of a flotilla of tables. Vanessa.
As you were speaking, Dugoli, what came to me is inviting people to this tentative distinction between pedestal agency and maybe, I think this is overused, but I will try it anyway. Mycelial agency, underground, right? And then figuring out the difference in sensibility. Because in pedestal agency, it is about moral purity. It's about categorizing and dividing and ordering and ranking, and determining for me and for others what. needs to be done. Whereas in mycelial agency, we would be tending to what's happening and be able to sit with the force and sense the movements and the forces and where the resources are going in terms of redistribution. For me, it's also the kind of signature I see in mycelial agency is mischief, basically. It's an agency of mischief. I'm not trying to posture, to perform, or to prove. I'm trying to do what I can do in this sensing of my ecology and the understanding that this ecology is connected with other ecologies and other ecologies and other ecologies, right? I've been trying for a long time, and through the work of the collective and Hospice in Modernity, to bring people into this inquiry. But if the book and the practices are read from pedestal agency, people are projecting onto the work what they want to see as moral purity. And it's very hard to negotiate that. People out of the pedestal into the ground, actually under the ground, so that it's not about being seen as doing something. It is about actually doing it. And some of the doings, you cannot actually tell anybody, right? Because otherwise it undermines the doing and your safety. And then understanding the cost of these doings, how people are running their bodies to the ground to keep that mycelium going without having to posture or to be seen or to compete for platform or visibility. So there's a lot of invisibilized mycelial labor of agency that doesn't get to be celebrated, and that's not the point. Celebration of it is not the point, because most of it needs to remain hidden for it to be effective, right? So there is a culture in pedestal agency that is about platform, is about legit competition for legitimacy. It is about having the certainties that would provide some level of security. But more and more, this is also some of the things, this is also being attacked, right, by the destabilization of everything. So I don't know how to invite people into mycelial agency. Everything that I've been trying actually is not working. And although like education is my thing, I can say that this is one of the most difficult things, the most challenging things, especially for cultures that have upheld the pedestal. So I don't know, maybe we might try something together at some point.
Yeah, that sounds like an inquiry to lean into together.
Yeah, and I appreciate the humility of that. I think I was just thinking when you were talking about the importance of doing the things that may best be not seen. Many of us are steeped into going, being in first grade or second grade in school and getting stars on the board from the teacher. We're so conditioned to be doing things in a performative way. It's kind of hard to unlearn that. We're at half an hour left, and I just want to let folks know that if you have questions, you can submit them in the Q&A. We're not going to have time to get to everyone's questions. I apologize, but we're looking at the questions, and asking the questions is as much part of the conversation as the answer, certainly. So encourage you to keep asking them. Before we transition to some of the questions we've gotten, though, I want to, just in the spirit of giving, we picked 3 names out of a proverbial hat to receive a copy of each of your books as a gift from us. And I'm just going to announce who those 3 people are, and we're going to follow up with you individually later. So that's Marty Roach, James Burke, and Zoe Vokes. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any names. And if you have the books already, then your task is to gift them on to other people. Okay, so let's turn to some of the questions we've gotten from folks. And let's start with a personal question. This is a question from someone to both of you, which is, how do you balance between paying attention to the broad big picture perspectives, like the ongoing exploration of modernity and more day-to-day social, political, and ecological quote-unquote current events? And how might these perspectives complement one another to positively influence how we choose to act with one another in the world? To either of you, how do you balance the day-to-day with the larger?
So I guess there's different kinds of day to day, isn't there? Because
Mhm.
the first thing that comes to mind for me when I hear about the day to day is, you know, being a parent and a partner and living in a small place where I try and be quite active in various things that go on in this little town. But the day to day is also the barrage of the news feeds and the kind of paradox of walking the line of a sense of needing to, not be unaware, but also that unless one is exercising a certain kind of agency in choosing how to relate to it, then you're just going to be drowned by the fire hose. And what's coming through the fire hose is getting nastier and nastier. Some of which is the algorithms and some of which is the events playing out in the world. And then there's these long arcs of these processes. And sometimes the length of the arc in itself can be an aid to grounding ourselves. You know, in the city where we were living when my son was born, which is about 90 kilometers from here, I used to go out walking on this ridge that was an esker. So it was what's left behind under where a river had run under the glaciers when there was 3 kilometers of ice on top of all of this landscape. And you could watch the migrating birds, the geese, when they were flying south in September, navigating by the line of this ridge that was the ghost of an ancient river stretching across the landscape. And sometimes that was exactly what I needed, to go there and be on that particular piece of land, which is where I first began to come into relation with Sweden as my adopted home and a landscape that began to come into focus for me, and to think about the climate changes that have shaped this land before creatures like I were here, and that there will be others to come. And it's not to lose yourself in that. It's just that that's part of how to be in the balance. And when it comes to the news, I think of something that came to me from Jade Connolly Duggan, who grew up with Illich as a family friend and who works with embodied practices of medicine from various traditions. And she wrote something in January. She said, look, pay attention to what's happening when your body is activated as if it's in immediate physical danger. And check, because maybe you are, in which case there's a set of actions that belong to that. But if you check and you're not actually in immediate physical danger, but your body is reacting as if you are, then to navigate these times, we need to develop the practices that allow us to climb down out of that without that climbing down being a going back to sleep and a lullaby and a pretending everything is okay. And I think that increasingly, you can apply the things that Vanessa and the collective write about in terms of the difference between mastery education and depth education to how we relate to the news, to how we relate to the flow of information that's coming in. That often what we need is not more information, but more capacity to know what we already know and to let that change us without breaking us, or let it break us in a way that's being broken open rather than just being left useless.
Thank you, Vanessa. Any response? Or
I think in our collective we talk about distinguishing between noise and signal, right? And between work, job, and distraction. So there's the work that needs to be done. That's the job that so far has paid the bills, but we don't know for how long it's gonna still be there. And then there is distraction, and sometimes distraction looks like overdoing, actually. right? So, and then there needs to be space for rest and restoration of the nervous system too, because we're working with extremely heavy analysis and now a heavy context for this analysis and a barrage of requests. And then we have to be doing some, it's not calculations, but a sensing into, like the mycelial sensing into, is more visibility what's needed right now? Do we need more podcasts? Do we need spaces to metabolize and process? There's a constipation going on, and many times people listen to more information as deflection from the work, which then exhausts the people who could be doing other work. So figuring out what what is my work to do, or what's the most responsible use of my time when there is too much demand for this time, in a mycelial way, what could be decomposed and redirected, what could be redistributed, what is my work to repair. All these questions are better held collectively, but in a collectivity that doesn't impose what you want to do, but that can hold the inquiry with you. So we don't want more collectivities that tell everybody what to do so that pedestally we can be seen as good people, but a collectivity that can sense where you are and how this connects to other ecologies, and then figure out what's the best use of the energy and the skills we have in service of the whole. So these are the kinds of things that we do and that we think about.
Thank you. What I'm sensing from some of the questions is an understandable urge to know how to act in more concrete ways with this. What does it mean to actively hospice modernity? How do we, there's a question from someone just around how do we protect nature in the present context, especially when the approach so far hasn't worked and now it's under attack, you know? So what do you say to folks within the context of, and maybe you answer this a little bit, Dugald, and maybe there's more to say on this, which is that there isn't a program, a list of things. There isn't something that you could tell everyone to do. There's people's circumstances are different, but holding that tension of feeling the need to act while also living with the inquiry and stepping off of the pedestal. What do you say to folks who are dealing right now? I could feel the tension that people have with this question.
Mhm. Well, there's a little back of an envelope list that that I have in the final chapter of At Work in the Ruins, and that seems to have kind of spread and taken on a bit of a life of its own, which is just an unfinished list of the kinds of task that make sense if it's your discernment that you're living in a time of endings. And the first one is the work of salvaging good things we have a chance of taking with us. So take responsibility for something. You know, it might be a small patch of land, it might be a particular species that you have an involvement with, it might be a cultural practice, it might be a corner of an organization that is doing something that really matters, that needs to be kept going as long as possible. And you take responsibility to the extent that you can with those who you can find for giving it a chance without pretending that you can control the outcome of that, or without shouldering the impossible responsibility of feeling like you'll have failed if you don't succeed in controlling it. So that's the first kind of task, salvaging good things we have a chance of taking with us. The second one is mourning good things that we're not getting to take with us. And the work of mourning includes telling the stories and singing the songs. You know, it includes making sure that the cultural memory of some good things that we're losing has a chance of being carried forward, because that cultural memory may yet turn out to be seeds in worlds that we can't imagine yet. The third kind of task is a task of discernment. It's a task of noticing the things that were never as good as we told each other they were. about the ways we've been doing things around here lately, and the chance to cut loose, to let go of some of those, to notice that the deep abiding social goods that have been associated with certain particular institutions don't depend on those institutions being around forever, but are actually a river beneath the river, something that has a far longer story within the histories of being human together. And it's worth attending to that rather than the institutional forms that have seemed to be the natural home of those things around here lately. And then the fourth kind of task is a task of picking up the dropped threads, noticing the things that have been overlooked and undervalued, treated as obsolete, old-fashioned, pushed to the edges, not marked on the maps, considered inefficient, that may turn out to make all the difference in our ability to go on making lives together under difficult circumstances in the times ahead. And so there, you might be taking responsibility for a particular practice, a particular skill that has come your way, and creating enough of a little community around it to give that a chance of being carried forward beyond your time. Those are just some examples, and it's an unfinished list. There are other kinds of action that are more related to the sharp end of resistance or dealing with emergencies that belong on that list as it goes on. But those are some of the things that you can attune your eyes to.
Can I go? Sure. So I would also say that in that layer that Dougal has outlined beautifully, there's also another layer of the body, right? So if you asked some of the indigenous people we work with in the Amazon, what do we do? The first thing they would tell you is you go into ceremony so that you can rebalance your umbilical cord with the land, and the land can tell you what's your work to do, right? To receive that signal. And if you have a lifelong practice of interpreting that signal, you would know. Although, like in Western society, we don't have a lifelong practice of interpreting signals, which then makes it a little bit more complicated. But in some of these signals may ask you to process the pain before you actually go into action. There's so much clutter that needs to be processed. And if you don't process that clutter, it's going to infuse your action with all the clutter, and generally it's clutter mixed up with arrogance, mixed up with that pedestal thing, mixed up with the need for validation and performance so that other people recognize you as a good person. Because inherently, what separation from the rest of nature does is that it inculcates a sense of worthlessness. And that sense of worthlessness drives us to be producing value in the economies of modernity and stay in the pedestal, because without the pedestal, we're nothing. It's either you're great or you're shit, right? So figuring out how to compost and decompose that pedestal into soil, to stay again with the land. It's not the doing of it, that kind of agency is not a doing to, it's a being with first and foremost in your body, in the land that is your body, in the land that your body is part of and that it belongs to and that it returns to when you do the transition. So, and it goes back to having death as a companion, as Dougal has pointed out, because with that death as a companion, with that sense of death as a companion, you see yourself as a point in a much larger continuum. You can't have a pedestal. Actually, the sense of, and I'm going to say this, and it's problematic, but the sense of insignificance is actually the relief, right? That it's not all on your shoulders. It's not all on you. It's actually you being the part of the web, the thread, and not the weave, that enables you to do the kind of action and the kind of agency that will actually move the threads to weave a different weave. But without that, you are, in Portuguese, the word is atropelando, running over. The movement's already and the rhythm's already at place. You're running over what the land is asking you to do. You can't hear the signal because there's so much clutter and a huge constipation of information and emotions that prevents you from being in presence or in available like to be able to do what the threads and the weaving are asking you to do.
I love your use of bodily terms, Vanessa. It constantly bring us back. Um, I I want to turn to the question of how folks on this in this conversation, listening in or observing it later, can speak with others in their lives who are not with us because maybe they have not come to the same point in their journey. Um, so curious. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Dougal, that I think at the top of this conversation, just the term modernity being a tricky one. So whether that it's use of that term or something else, what would you advise folks in terms of how to engage with loved ones in their lives, community members who you talked earlier about people who work at NGOs who maybe had read your book a few years ago and maybe there's a moment now where they feel like they can bring it up. So what would be the way, not as an elevator pitch necessarily, but as an invitation? What do
Yeah.
you find might be useful for folks?
Well, invitation is a good word in its own right, because invitation already takes us into the kinds of agency that are left when you've surrendered the pedestal agency. Invitation is precisely how human beings come into relation and into being together and doing together without the power of the state or the power of the market managing to make it be as someone says. I think more generally, in answer to this question, you know, your job is not to be a salesman for the apocalypse. Like no one, we don't need any salesmen or evangelists for hospicing modernity or for the ruins or any of it. That would be a disastrous misconception. For some of us, our work might include being a living question mark, like going about your life in such a way that the choices you're making, the actions you're taking, the ways in which you're showing up speak to possibilities that are not marked on the maps of the dominant culture, and which now and then awaken curiosity and lead into conversations. It's also, there is something to be said for, um, you know, not being alone with the things that are keeping you awake at night. And it's often the case that your immediate family or partner or colleagues or whatever are not in a place to be part of the vessel in which it's possible to talk about the things which are keeping you awake at night. That can change over time, but it doesn't change as a result of your need and you're trying to persuade them. It changes because their own experiences bring them to a place where they're able to understand that funny thing that you said 6 months ago or 6 years ago. So there's a lot to be said for finding a pocket. And this is one of the places where, this strange technology of the internet can help us. Finding a pocket in which it's possible to go into depth conversation with others who are sitting with the same things or similar things to what you're sitting with. But then, there's got to be a rhythm or an oscillation about this. I got asked to speak at the Swedish Transition Towns annual gathering last year, and the transition movement is quite strong and deeply anchored in Sweden. And I went along and I told them about my experiences of slowly making a home in this small town where no one will ever mistake me for coming from here. But I can become a part of here, partly as a result of the way that I show up. And I can learn things. I can be humbled through the experience of learning how to show up as a part of this place, where a lot of the things that might give me status in situations that might look or feel like being on a pedestal don't count, don't matter. And I spent 6 months around this table having meetings with the people who run the local community-run music venue. And there's a guy who drives big machines in the forest, and there's a woman who's a nurse, and there's a guy who works in their the supermarket, and there's a guy who ran a petrol station for 30 years, and all of them are more useful to the running of this community venue than I've figured out to be. And then one day, while we were talking about the need for some posters, I started mocking something up on my laptop, and they were like, how do you do this magic? And so here, very few people where I live have read or even know about my books, but I'm known as someone who's really helpful with making those posters and the website for the venue. And I'm telling this to the community, to the transition towns people at this national gathering. And I'm saying, because when the shit hits the fan, you don't want to only know the people who turned up to the transition meeting. Like, part of your work in between the acute episodes of crisis is practicing. You know, read any book by someone who's lived through a war, and they say war is these long stretches of boredom interspersed by these moments of crisis. What do you do within the boredom? Well, partly you go about the business of meeting basic needs, but partly also you practice. You do things that give you capacity for the next time you find yourself in one of those acute moments. And that might be a good metaphor for how we navigate the times that more and more people are now realizing we're in. We're still under conditions of practicing, conditions that are quite boring a lot of the time, but there will be more and more of these acute episodes. So part of the practice is the practice of increasing the number of people who know each other's names, who smile when they see each other, who are in relation with each other in the place where you find yourself, if you're in a position to contribute to that, so that in the acute moments, there is more capacity where you are to draw on. So those are some of the ways that that I've been thinking about this stuff.
Thank you. Vanessa, any advice from you on how to speak with others, or if you should speak with others?
I was paying attention to the goal, and then I forgot the question. So
it's just about how to relate to others who are not yet apparently grappling with.
Yeah, I remembered now. So what I think is happening too is that we have so much saturated cognitive load and emotional load now that when we go into a relationship, we want to process that with each other, and that becomes a transaction, right? So I have my constipation, you have your constipation, and suddenly there is diarrhea everywhere. Back to your bodily things. And it's kind of not working. And what we are observing with the young people that have come really close at this point to the collective, saying, okay, what now? Is that there needs to be a space for the processing of the saturation before you can even be available to each other in that way that Hugo is talking about, so that we're grounded and that we become the question mark that invites people into a mycelial agency inquiry. That oversaturation is becoming a pressure cooker, right? And back to the kitchen. And it's like we see the different layers of complexity, we collapse them into one layer, impose a narrative of coherence, edit out what doesn't fit, and police the borders. And that is taking a lot of our energy and creating a lot of anxiety. And before we see lentils everywhere, we need to figure out how to find a safe way of getting the steam out and this to be processed. But when everybody is doing that, we don't have many options. So our collective is exploring options that involve technology. Our collective is exploring options that steer this technology to release the pressure and nudge people towards each other and towards the world and towards the pain that we have been avoiding feeling, but in a way that we can process them collectively, this pain collectively. Pain, collective pain specifically, the teachings we have received from indigenous and Afro-descendant communities is that stuck pain creates a pool where we can drown in, and and collective pain cannot be processed by individual hearts. Individual hearts get overwhelmed by collective pain. It needs a collective to process, to process. And processing the pain is allowing it to dance and to move and to transform. And it gets transformed into insight, into depth. Avoiding the pain is a problem. And that's what modernity has taught us to do, to numb and to avoid. So for us, for a long time, for the last 10 years, our first job with any group has been to, and expressed as creating the stomach to face and be present to the ship that needs to be composted, both literal and metaphorical, without throwing up on each other, without throwing a tantrum, and without throwing in the towel. Without that stomach, then we are either going to be running away from the pain into the rainbow and looking for a unicorn, or we're going to drown in the sadness, the anger, and the frustration and despair of it. So figuring out how to face what's difficult, what's painful, without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, without wanting quick fixes or wanting to be rescued from the discomfort is the first thing that we need to do. And I think, and if we're thinking about leverage points to do it at scale, it's going to be a very difficult call, right? I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We're just about at time, and what I want to do is close with giving each of you a minute. But before I do, let me just express my gratitude to the two of you, to everyone who has joined us for this conversation, and just to let you know that we will be sending a follow-up email with. There are many resources that people shared in the chat, and we're going to compile those and share it with you all, since you can't copy and paste it yourself. So I just want to express my gratitude. And then in closing, maybe to ask each of you in a minute, what question, challenge, or action would you pose to our audience members to consider as they leave this conversation and go back to their quote unquote, daily lives? So starting with you, Dougal.
Maybe it's something that echoes what Vanessa was saying a few minutes ago, because I want to say, we've talked quite a bit about doing and about action. Notice what action is grounded in. Notice what speaking is grounded in. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of panic that are appropriate responses to the depth of the trouble we're in. But the appropriate way to be with those responses is to feel them, to let them happen, to let them keep moving. And what I see a lot of the time is people attempting to speak from or act from those kinds of places. And very rarely will any good come from an invitation that is made out of fear or out of anger or out of panic. If you can learn how to let it move, let it pass through you, which again requires being able to do it with others as well as on your own, and get to a place of stillness. If you can speak from and act from a place of stillness, there is a quiet, gentle power that can come from that can be far more consequential, even though it's not as quick as acting and speaking out of those places of reactivity. So I see where that touches you, see what there is within your field that you can bring to that and to those ways of showing up.
Thank you. And Vanessa?
So there's a book that is coming in August. It's going to be published in August, called Outgrowing Modernity, Navigating Complexity, Complicity, and Collapse with Compassion and Accountability. And there are 3 questions that start the inquiry of the book. One is, what if you knew in your bones, not just in your head, that what is comfortable today is not going to be viable very soon? And what if you could respond from a space, or what if we could collectively respond from a cultural space of emotional sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and interspecies and intergenerational responsibility? What would we be doing then? And then also the question is, what would somebody born today 30 years from now, look back and say what you did was really helpful. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you both. And that last question just resonates with the what you talked about earlier, which is dying a good death. So on that lovely note, thank you all. Have a wonderful evening or day, and thank you for staying with the trouble with us. Thank you, Dougal. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.